You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
We'll try to spice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Yeah. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I am excited. I'm doing an artist interview with Emil Wilson, the creator of the new book coming out called The Nightingales. This episode is dropping right before the book comes out, so I am very excited. Thank you for joining us, Emil Wilson.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
I guess before we get into your artistic background and everything, I think we got to do the sort of business end of this. The book is called The Nightingales. It is a graphic novel, which I got to say, I was really taken in by this because the style is not what I typically think of with graphic novels. Like this, I opened it up and it immediately felt to me like a visual journal. You know, like it has this very intimate quality. Can you talk about just like the very quick inspiration for the book and why you made it? Like what inspired you to write the book and in this particular style?
Sure. Well, first of all, the book is based on a kindness that my dad did many years ago, which was in 1985. We lived in a small town in Oregon, and he worked with this man who he said who was sick and who didn't have a place to live, and they were colleagues. And he invited this man and his two dogs to move into our home. I wasn't there. I was at college, although I did come home and I met Jim and the dogs. What became very obvious and what we all discovered in different ways is that Jim actually had AIDS, and he had been evicted from his home because he was gay. And it was interesting because Jim's presence in the house kind of brought out the best and the worst in my family, in that, my father his compassion he didn't think how it might impact the rest of the family. I think my mother was understandably uncomfortable with having a stranger there. And my sister, and one of the things about the book is that there's this friendship that blossoms between the teenage daughter who's based on my sister, and this friendship kind of transforms the two of them, certainly her. And I think that when I was thinking I wanted to write the book and it was based on a memory, I wanted to find a way. My background is in advertising, so I wanted to find a way that used visual language to help tell that concept. And one of the things that I'd always been really inspired by is an artist's sketchbook. And the reason that I love artist sketchbooks is because you sort of see the artist expressing themselves, and they don't really censor themselves. And they, there are some things that they draw out that are very well observed and heavily detailed. And then there are some things that they start and abandon, or it's a rough sketch and you sort of half there. And I just kept thinking, if there was a way that I could visualize what remembering and what memory is, it would look like an artist's sketchbook. And so I think that that's why I wanted to make the book look the way it did. I think that there are a lot of graphic novels out there. I think that a lot of them look, the art form comes from comics. So everything is very paneled. There's a lot of word balloons. I mean, we've all seen what a comic looks like. And I think graphic novels have taken that and kind of run with it. And my background just isn't in comics. Originally, I didn't read them as a child, so I didn't think in those terms. And so when I thought about how is this going to look, I kind of didn't allow myself to be like, well, this is what everyone else is doing. I think I was like, no, I kind of want to do something a little different, and felt confident in that. So that's why it looks the way it does.
Yeah. And, you're already like giving me a perfect segue to what I wanted to ask about, because I always feel like an artist's biography and their own life experiences inform so much of the work and the style. And you've already alluded to the fact that you said growing up, you weren't like a comics guy.
No.
Can you tell us about your background, like how did you come to arts as more than just a hobby? I know you said you got into advertising, but presumably before that, there was a moment where things clicked for you. Give us your creative origin story, if you will.
Sure. I mean, I think that one of the things that I have always possessed has been I think very visually. I think that I like to do a lot of different types of art. And one of the things that made me choose advertising maybe over other things, over other art forms, is that advertising is this wonderful intersection of, there are so many art creative skills that you bring to advertising. You deal with music, you deal with all kinds of elements of film, you deal with writing, you deal with screenwriting, you deal with objects that have to be sent to clients and audience members. It's just this really wonderful, culmination of a bunch of different skills. And so that's kind of what I got into advertising for. I didn't read a comic book until I was in my 50s, and the reason that I didn't was because it wasn't that's what I didn't want to read. I didn't read comics, and so they weren't the things that I chose when I went to read something. And the way I got into comics was sort of this sort of backdoor way, was that about 10 years ago, a close friend of mine passed away suddenly, and a bunch of her friends all got together. We rented a house and spent the weekend together, kind of telling each other what we should do with our lives. I think that we had all just turned 50, and we realized that, I think at 50, you kind of realize that, okay, the time I have left on the earth is somehow less than the time I've already spent on the earth. And I think it was that imbalance plus her passing that made us all think, okay, well, if there's something on the bucket list that we need to do, now would be a good time to start thinking about it. And, so we went around the room and everybody kind of was like, you should open that business you've always wanted to do. You've always wanted to be a parent, so you should look into that. And my friends all said, you need to go to art school. And I didn't need to go to art school. I mean, I had worked as an art director. I did illustration freelance on the side. I had a side hustle with pottery. I was a printmaker on the weekends. I think what they were saying, and I know what they were saying because they said it, which was, doing art has never been the thing for you. It's always been the other thing. This is your work has been something else. And for once in your life, you should go to an art school where you concentrate on the art and the art becomes your main thing, because you're good at this. And I don't think that I don't think that I really realized like, oh, I can actually do something here. I think that I just thought, well, it's just a hobby and that's fine. But they really pushed me to doing something else. And so I said, well, the problem with an art school is that I have to choose a discipline. Like, I don't really want to be a painter all the time. And they said, well, what about graphic novels? Because then you can do writing and you can do design and you can do art. And I thought, well, comics are kind of like, isn't that comics basically for like teenage boys? Like, I don't want to write about superheroes and fantasy worlds. And they were like, well, you should probably read some graphic novels and see what's out there. And I did that. And so I ended up going to a school in White River Junction, Vermont, which is the Center for Cartoon Studies. And that was the art school I chose. So that was sort of my journey into comics, I guess.
Wow, that's an amazing, it's so funny how sometimes your friends have insights into you and what would click for you, just because, it's hard to be accurately self-reflective and realize things. You sometimes need that outside perspective pointing it out. And
right.
I think we're all fortunate that your friends steered you in the right direction, because you're doing this very well.
Well, thank you. And who better to tell you what to do with your life than a drunk friend? So they're like, let me tell you what you need. So yeah, that's exactly right.
For any younger listeners, don't listen to your drunk
don't
friends.
Listen to that.
They're not the ones who really know what's going on. But it is interesting. So you came to you came to the arts, it sounds like mostly as a hobbyist. And then as you got older, you realized that there was something more serious to pursue, and you went to school to study
Right.
specifically graphic novels and comics and everything like that. Um, Really fascinating. So I'm going to be honest, I was not much of a comics guy either. And I was surprised at the amount of media that you're bringing into this, because I always thought of comics as more sort of traditional print, color separations and stuff like that. And I love the way yours has this, like, watercolor technique going on. Like, you're really bringing in a lot of media. And I guess the question that I have for you is, like, as an artist, as you're planning this,
Mhm.
how are you selecting the media? Is it kind of intuitive, or are you thinking like, oh, you know what, the fluidity of watercolor is going to work well to set the tone in this way? Like, are you that sort of cerebral, methodical type? Are you that sort of instinctive type? How's it come about?
You know what? It's so funny hearing you ask the question, because such a part of me that's like, God, I wish I was the guy that sounded really cool, that sounded really like the intelligence that you asked that with, of like, that somebody would be that meticulous and cerebral about it. It's like, I'm just not. When I do art, I'm a little bit like a 5-year-old, in that I have a studio that is, there's markers, there's watercolors, there's pencils, there's paint. And I'm so fickle and such a small attention span. I kind of just play around, and I just kind of want it to be all the things. And there are some days where I'm like, nope, I'm just going to do pencils today. And then there are days it's like, oh no, let's get the watercolors out and let's play around. And I think, every artist has a different perspective on it. But for me, I think that I work best when I just feel like I'm having fun. I haven't really overthought it. I kind of am very open to the mistakes, and I just let it kind of happen. And if a mistake happens, it has to be a pretty bad mistake. But generally it's like, yeah, that's cool. I'll take that. That's great. And I think that the book is a reflection more of me just kind of playing around than it is me coming to it with any sort of like rational direction. And I think that the sketchbook visual language that I set up sort of forgave all those sins, because I think that in a sketchbook, an artist can do whatever he wants and play around with whatever he wants. And it'll be interesting in the future with other projects if that same sort of freedom applies, and how that freedom evolves and takes shape. But for this book, I just wanted to kind of do whatever I felt and not check myself. And I don't have a lot. I mean, I have no formal training with like how watercolors work, or acrylic, or oil pastels, or all the things that are on my desk. But that's part of the fun of it. And sometimes, I mean, I was a printmaker who was basically more interested in the way color sat on top of color than I was about the repetition and the additioning that a lot of printmakers do. I just like the way the colors sit on top of each other, and how that misregistration can really make for really interesting art. And I think the same is true for this book.
I see. That's an answer that fascinates me, because like I hear what you're saying, and I love it on so many levels, but also I kind of hate you a little bit, because I am not somebody for whom this stuff comes intuitively, and it's like, oh, it must be so nice to have that ease, because having looked at all of your work, I'm sitting there analyzing it. I'm like, I wonder how he decided this was the color palette for this page. And I wonder how he decided this was the one to, I don't want to say develop further, because all of them feel developed, but you know what I'm saying? Like, some
Absolutely.
feel more meticulously rendered, or more worked over, and others seem quicker. And it's just like, oh, you just get it. You just understand art. And in a way that I really wish I could. Like I'm the type of person who's like, well, if we think about the principles of design, it says that we need this contrast here and we need this counterbalance here.
I don't know any of that stuff, which I guess frees me up. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things that was I don't know if I'd call it a happy accident, but one of the things that I learned in doing this book is that as it went along, I became a better artist towards the end of the book than I was at the beginning of the book. And as we went into editing it and we had to change some artwork at the beginning of the book, I had to really work hard to be like, no, this can't be as polished as some of this other stuff. And maybe none of it should be polished. Like I just
Mhm.
found that the drawings that happened several months in were getting better, and I hadn't counted on that. I just sort of assumed that my skill level would kind of just sort of stay at the same level, and that just didn't happen. I'm better. I'm a better artist now because of that book than I was at the beginning.
Well, now, I do want to take time because, like, whenever I am fortunate enough to have an artist on, I do always want to learn more about their methods and, like,
Mhm.
really specifically how it comes about, because yes, I can look at it and have a sense for what a sketching process looks like.
Mm.
But I'm curious from like the very first stages, are you writing the text and planning out how many pages it's going to be and then figuring out the illustrations that go with that? Or, like how do you sort of storyboard it? What's the physical process and the steps along the way? And what are the checkpoints with your editors and stuff? Because I imagine you have to coordinate with people. So you probably don't want to go too far down one path and then find out like, oh no, we have to redo everything.
It's interesting. This book was a very different path than a lot of the process that most cartoonists and graphic novels go down. Mostly because a lot of graphic novels are sold on a pitch, and then you sort of show your editor, your thumbnails, you show them your tight sketches, and you show them the tight drawings. And this book was acquired when it was finished, so it was all done. And what was interesting to me is that when as a graphic novelist, unlike probably a prose novelist, a graphic novelist knows how many pages their book is going to be. And when the book was sold, it was like 460 pages. And one of the first discussions I had with my editors was, I'd like to trim that down. I'd like the thing to come in under 400 pages. And I think that they were pleased with that. I mean, I'm sure that cutting a book 15% is great for the bottom line, but I think that they were wonderful in terms of like, we'll publish this however you want. But I thought it should be a little bit slimmer. And instead of taking out a section or two, I just chose to condense it. And again, this is kind of where the sketchbook covered up a lot of the sins, is that I would take 6-page sequences and turn them into a 2-page sequence. And the way that I generally did the book when I started was that I wrote all the text out, and then I just started drawing, as a lot of cartoonists do, but I just drew everything singular. I mean, I just drew everything separately and then combined it um, in Photoshop. I didn't do anything in Photoshop. I'm not a digital artist by any means, but I certainly
Mhm.
can use a scanner and composite things, and that's something that I've done for years in advertising. But one of the reasons that I do that is that I want control over everything. And it's funny that you would bring up like the watercolor and the pastels, because every single thing that you see on every single page is usually its own layer. Not because I have incredible control issues when it comes to my art, but I just want to know that I can move things around, make things bigger, make things smaller if I need to. And it was funny when you go in to edit a book, it's a bit like an accordion in that you condense some things. And there was another sequence that was 2 pages that became a 10-page sequence. And that I needed new art for, and then use some of the art that I had cut from other parts of the book. But editing was just crazy. Whereas I think most cartoonists write the whole script and then spend time drawing based on that script. I have the problem that I will be revising something, both the art and the writing, until it's ripped out of my hands. I my deadline becomes the deadline becomes the point where it's over, but I will keep revising. And I think that with a lot of cartoonists, there's a point where you can't revise anymore because you're so limited by the space. You've got, if you have a page with 9 panels and you take out panel 3 and panel 4, all those panels have to move up and you have to create new artwork where it all floods in from the next succeeding pages. But, my process is draw a bunch of things that I know I want and then kind of composite them and then build the story that way. And it's easier to edit for sure. So
Okay,
that feels like
so
a very convoluted answer, but hopefully some of it made sense.
no, it does make sense, but I do want to check my understanding
Yeah.
and tease one thing out for listeners who may be less familiar with like Photoshop and everything like that.
Sure.
So as I'm understanding it, you said you work in layers and you put different elements on different layers. So when I'm picturing, let's say, an ink sketch of a figure and a wash of watercolor, I am interpreting you to mean that the wash of watercolor is its own layer and then the ink sketch is its own layer, so that the contour line drawing can be separated and you can change the proportions and where and how it overlaps with the ink wash. And so like on a page that has several sketches, it seems like they're all on their own individual layers and then you're arranging them almost like a digital collage. Am I right there?
That's exactly right. In fact, everything, just think about it this way, is that regardless of what art software you're using, I scan each picture in separately. So I basically have 10 pictures and then I can use those pictures however I want. I can make some bigger and some smaller, but they always remain 10 individual pictures. And so if I go to move something, it doesn't move the other 9 pictures. I just move that one or resize that one. And all that does is it's like arranging drawings on a bulletin board or on a floor. It allows me to, it just allows me to kind of collage exactly in that way. And it doesn't matter. Sometimes they're drawings and sometimes they're pieces of paper and sometimes they are a hatch mark or a coffee cup stain that I accidentally put into my sketchbook and was like, well, this is cool. I'll just scan this too. And all of it is just its individual pictures that you then move and arrange according to what you want.
Yeah. So you developed this book really on spec. You had your idea of what the story was that you wanted to tell. You wrote your story and then you made all your illustrations. And as I'm understanding it, the illustrations were individually composed for each individual page within Photoshop or an equivalent program. And then you took that each composition out, it was exported from there to your page layout program or whatever, so that as you were editing your composition for a page, it's not gonna I don't know, spill over to the other pages the way that like, a Google Doc, if you resize an image, it suddenly the page breaks happen differently and stuff like that.
Yeah, every page was very much its own. It was very much its own thing. And then when I went to edit it, sometimes I'd be like, oh, well, this drawing is better on this page, and I would move it over. But primarily, I would create the art as a single page spread so that all the pages are, when you open the book, it's one whole one piece of art that you're looking at, and within that piece of art are it's all collaged together. So
yeah, well, and I mean it makes sense because every as I was looking through it, like everything was cohesive as a spread. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Which I'm curious, how do you handle like just logistically the bleed areas and stuff where the binding of the book is, you've got that like, that middle sort of gutter or whatever. I
Right.
don't know the official language they use to talk about it, but
That's it. You got it.
I thought it was, but like I'm reaching way back in my head for that. But like how do you make sure that like the person's nose isn't lost in the fold,
Well, I mean, that's a great question. And sometimes, there were a couple of lessons learned in the final printed book. I mean, there were a couple of pages I was like, ooh, that was close to that gutter. The way that it works with publishing is that they're very specific about text, and they have a very strict rule about the text has to fall within this window, and you can't go outside of that window. Art is a different animal, and certainly for this book it was, and there were several things that kind of crossed the gutter. The one thing that I'm so pleased about is that Avid Reader Press, the publisher of the book, bent over backwards to make sure that those pages lined up in the gutter so that it felt really seamless. And when you see the final printed book, it's remarkable how good it looks. And even though it looks like a real sketchbook that is open, the sketchbook is a metaphor. So there are things that kind of do sort of cross the gutter that might not really cross the gutter if it were an actual sketchbook. Then there was certainly a point when I first sold the book where I thought, oh, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try to build this really quickly onto a real book and just sort of scan that real book so it always looks like it's organic. And then I could never make it look right. The lighting was off. The when you'd scan it, it was off, or if I photographed it, it looked wrong. And I just realized that the sketchbook is really a metaphor for how she's thinking about memory, which is kind of where I had started. And I thought it needed to look real for it to be real, and it didn't. It was a fascinating lesson to sort of, and again, I come back to advertising, because I think if I had been in an agency, I would have worked really hard to make it feel organic, like a real sketchbook, and you were looking down at it. And I'm happy that I couldn't create that effect, and I ended up having to go with something that it felt more pleasing to the eye. I mean, the background for every page spread is this open book, and it's the same visual every page. And the thing that changes is the art that's on top of it. And I think after a while, it's kind of like when you're at a theater and you're looking at a proscenium, it just all kind of fades away and you just focus on the thing that's in the middle. And I love that. I love that happy accident that you get that you didn't know. Like, rationally, you're like, this has to look this way. But as you actually see it in a printed book, you're like, no, it was right the first time. And this looks perfect. So that was a good happy accident.
Yeah, I think that's the way it would have to go, just because if I'm envisioning what it would look like if you scanned an actual three-dimensional, I imagine it would come out like a zine. You know what I mean? Where you've got like the weird cast shadows and stuff that would become perhaps an interesting element, but it changes the tone. And I think there's a more intimate connection with the fact that it's a clean print the way that you did it, because of the fact that like the cleanness of it to me brings an intimacy of it, of like I'm looking at the primary source and not a copy of the journal or sketchbook or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
I do. I absolutely know what you're saying. And I think the other piece of it is that I think I would get very distracted if I was looking at something that felt like a bunch of things in a book. I think I would be so overly interested in how those things were laid out because they were real objects. Then, if I just look at the clean art that's on there. And I think what that does is that it kind of focuses you on the story, which is what you want anyway. I think that what you want is the least amount of distractions visually that don't help tell the story. And I think that's kind of what happened. And so I'm really happy that it kind of worked out the way it did.
That feels like such the advertiser coming out with like, I want something that's not distracting from the overall message. And I mean that in like the best possible way. Like my
I
hat is
take it as
off
the
to
best possible way.
advertisers who are
Absolutely.
able to communicate so efficiently with like the limited time that they have.
Yeah.
You've already kind of hinted to your ad background coming out in stuff. Were there other ways that background came out in the creation of this?
Oh yeah, lots and lots of them. There were I mean there are so many similarities with advertising and comics. And I mean obviously the big one is that you know text you take text and you take visuals, and those things have to kind of work together, and it's the tension and the connection of those things that makes an advertisement or a comic. um and so what's interesting is that the visuals and the text have to kind of create a third thing. And what I mean by that is that there's this exercise that they do in advertising school where you have a headline, a visual, and a logo. And they do this thing where they cover up the visual, so you just read the headline and the logo, and it has to mean something. And then they cover up the headline, and you look at just the visual and the logo, and it has to mean something else. And then when you see all three of them together, they mean something completely different. And that's what makes advertising sort of an interesting art form in terms of a visual and a text communication. Um, the same is true with comics, is that you use text and visual to tell a story. And it's funny, there's this thing that comes up a lot in comics school about, well, illustration is different than comics. And I always thought that was really reductive because, one of the things, like when you think about like the story of Sleeping Beauty,
Mm-hmm.
if you have the story of Sleeping Beauty and it's illustrated by Quentin Blake, it's whimsical and it's quirky and it's funny. And if you have the same Sleeping Beauty tale illustrated by Maxfield Parrish, it's lush and it's epic. And I think that those adjectives help tell the story. And I think that that's true in advertising because so much of the visual that you choose help tell you something about the brand that you might not get from just the headline or the visual. And I think that that's what's similar in comics. I think there's a lot of differences in comics. I mean, obviously there's clients and there's what you're trying to get the person to do. Like I think that advertising has messaging and it asks you, there's a call to action,
Mm-hmm.
but that comics don't have. But I do think that those are the similarities, is how text and visual work together. There are it's funny when you do comics, there are a lot of comic artists who read a lot of comics. That makes sense. I mean, people who read a lot of books. But it's funny because a lot of comic artists will go to other comics for inspiration. And in advertising, you never look at advertising for inspiration ever. It's you would just never do that because your whole point is that you want to be different than what everybody else is doing. And I thought that that was a really interesting difference, because I feel like one of the things that helped motivate this book was that I didn't want it to look like what everybody else was doing. And I didn't read a lot of comics to get inspired. I was looking at, like I said, sketchbooks, how artists make mistakes. I looked at a lot of like drawings that had been started but had been abandoned. I really love seeing how the artist is trying to work out the problems in their head. And that felt really right for the book. And yet things that were paneled with dialogue in balloons, I was like, I don't have any interest in that right now for this project. So I guess in that way, comics helped, and comics is different than advertising really helped and it didn't help. So
I mean, that makes sense. I hadn't thought about it in that way, but like, yeah, I mean, a lot of art is referential and filled with these Easter eggs that make you feel smart for noticing the references that they've got. But advertisers, I can see where that would be sort of the kiss of death for an ad campaign if it feels derivative of something else. Because
oh yeah,
like the whole like you say, the whole point is to differentiate your brand and make sure that people know that this is the product they want. So I guess I should do the ad thing and put in a call to action here. Everybody should check the links in the show notes and pick up your copy of The Nightingales, because as we have already alluded to, this is a brilliant book, and it is, I guess, semi-autobiographical, but that has to mean a lot to you, and there has to be a lot that is deeply personal for you in this.
Right.
But for our audience,
Mhm.
what are you hoping they take away from this?
Yeah, there are a couple things that I hope they take away from it. I hope, I hope this book goes a long way to make people interested in graphic novels in general. I think that, graphic novels have always sort of been relegated to something for children, or something that feels, I don't know, that it's not very serious, or that it's action. Um, I think that that's all changed now. I think that graphic novels can provide a really rich reading experience. I also feel like, as I can just speak for myself, I love reading all different kinds of things and to see how people tell story. And if there's an interesting way to tell a story that I'm not used to, I'm completely open to it. And
Mhm.
I think that graphic novels offer that. And when I sent my agent the book initially, he called back. He wasn't my agent at the time. He called back and he's like, I don't read graphic novels, but I like this one. I mean, this one feels different to me, and I was really moved by it, and I really like what it's saying. And for me, that's always been the North Star, in that I would love people who don't read graphic novels to read this graphic novel and then go and read other graphic novels. Um, I think the other thing that I would love them to take away is, the Nightingales takes place at a point in time where there was a lot of fear and misunderstanding in the mid 80s for people who had AIDS. And I feel like at the core of the book is this message that compassion can kind of transform a life. And I think in this time where things feel really divisive and really, um, combative, that if people read this book and they feel like, wow, I forgot what it's like to, what kindness can sort of do to change somebody, I think that would be really amazing. And I mean, look, I love the idea that people who read this book are like, I like reading about things that are kind, people who are kind, and what the complications that kindness can bring. So
Mhm.
I hope that's a takeaway that people have.
Yeah, and I want to just like subscribe to your newsletter and adopt those thoughts and insights and pretend they were my own, because I think that's so wonderfully said. Graphic novels, I think, historically kind of got a bad rep because of the fact that, people have this, I think, misperception of what they are,
Right.
as, essentially a giant collection of the funnies that we would see in the newspapers back
Exactly.
in the day when I was growing up. But really, the graphic novel landscape is really rich and diverse, and your book is a stunning example of that.
Thank you.
It's like I said, it's just all very well rendered in a way that feels fresh and different from any other graphic novels that I've picked up. And I am always a sucker for a story of kindness, but not it's not like a it's not like a syrupy story of kindness.
No,
Like,
no,
you know
no,
what
no,
I'm
no, no.
saying? Like
Thank you.
it it has that authentic look of like real world implications of like what all of this meant, and it's beautiful and mature and wonderfully rendered.
Well,
So I hope anyone who's interested in that kind of work will, like I said, check the links in the show notes. The book is hitting stores tomorrow if you're listening the day this is published, so head out, check out your copy of The Nightingales. But once again, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights in this process and a beautiful book.
well, thank you for having me. This is great. This is really great.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.